As you can see from these credits that go on forever, a lot of people were involved in making this movie. And with us tonight, we've got our other executive producer, Gerry Solomon. Gerry, can you stand up? I can't see you, but if you're here. Gerry helped pull all the posts together, especially the animations, which were done by a company called PSYOP. And they did an absolutely brilliant job. My producer, Bill Metzger, is here. Bill. And I also want to introduce Dan Oberall, who did an amazing job editing. A really big round of applause for Dan.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Malone, and allow me to introduce our panelists tonight. Really great. Thank you. I'll try to do it in order.
Is that thing turned on? Can you hear him okay?
Can you hear me?
No.
Turn that pot up a little bit. Thank you.
Did you turn your thing on? There we go. Go.
To my immediate right, Vint Cerf, Google's chief internet evangelist and widely known as one of the fathers of the internet. Next, Rick Smolan, executive producer, the human face of big data. Then Linda Avey, biologist and founder of 23andMe. Quentin Clark, chief business officer, SAP. And Sandy Smolan, director, the human face of big data. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
You know, it's hard enough to follow, pets and children, but to follow a documentary with those kind of production values, first of all, my compliments. That's extraordinary. Amazing job. But we'll give it a shot. So let's begin with, one of the characteristics of technology revolutions is they usually start with a very specific definition. And then as they take off, everyone wants to get on board. Everyone, remember cloud computing? I don't even know what cloud computing means anymore since everybody's jumped onto the bandwagon. Big data 3 years ago or 4 years ago seemed to have a very specific definition. Now it's grown nebulous. Would one or two of you like to try a definition?
Well, first of all, I think it's obvious that everybody does jump on the bandwagon, and the entomologists are next, except we'll bug data instead of big data. That'll be the next one. Actually, just to go back to cloud for a minute, why they call it cloud computing. When we were designing the internet, we drew pictures of networks as clouds because we didn't care what was going on inside. We just cared that there was this boundary and that was the edge of the net, and we hooked them all together, so we drew them as a collection of clouds. And when people started putting computers at the edges, they started speaking about cloud computing. I think the honest answer is that big data is simply about huge quantities of information accumulated in one way or another, processed by a bunch of processors, and that's really all it is. Anybody else want to try this?
Well, it sort of seems like the timing of this, it reminds me of the early days of the desktop publishing revolution. You needed to have the Apple computer, PostScript, and PageMaker all evolve at the same moment, and it seems like the fact that now all these sensors have basically plummeted to almost zero. The cost now of sensors, we're all carrying them, and they can be used for other purposes. The internet is, everywhere, it's ubiquitous. The cost of processing, thanks to Moore's law, is getting cheaper and cheaper. So this idea that, imagine if you touched your finger to the stove, and it took a month to know that you burnt your finger. Like, was it the stove or was it the hamburger you ate the next day? Or there's this disconnection of cause and effect, and that we have this real-time feedback loop. To me, that's what big data is. It's like suddenly we've connected all the nerves together, and now the brain's getting information from this whole planet simultaneously.
It's always about data. It's just that we could do more with it now than we ever could before because the economics are driving our ability to do that.
What I love about what Linda's done is this gamification of health. It used to be that devices that measured you were for sick, old, infirmed people. And now Sandy and I can see how I live in New York and Sandy lives in LA, and we can compete to see who takes more steps during the day wearing our jawbone. I mean, this idea of making the measuring of yourself. My wife thinks this is Northern Californian self-absorbed hippie craziness, but this idea of measuring yourself and seeing what's normal for you, and then having the system say, there's something different about you right now, you should pay attention to this early on, not when you're really already showing signs of illness.
That's right.
Maybe we can
That's
talk
right.
about 23andMe.
Well, and 23andMe was just the beginning, right? That's when you look at the grand scheme of all the data that our bodies put out. We generate probably, exabytes or more data, even on an hourly basis. If you look at the cellular level, what's going on with our metabolism, and then how we're responding to our environments is also a huge piece. And Juan Enriquez, in his book, which I highly recommend, Evolving Ourselves, we've changed our environment so much, we don't even begin to know how our bodies are now going to respond to what we've put into the environment. So there's a whole big set of learning that we need to do from the big data that we're going to start to capture from ourselves because we're wearing sensors, we're wearing these devices. And I'm wearing one right now that's a ring that tracks sleep. It's probably the best sleep tracker on the market at this point, but it's called Oura, O-U-R-A, and it's a company based out of Finland. But this, yay. So it's, this, but we're just at this very nascent point of being able to capture these exabytes of data that have been coming off our body since the beginning of the human species. And so what do we do with that data is really the question. And to your point, Mike, about a term that becomes something big that everybody talks about and then it seemingly disappears is like the cure for cancer. And we were, this was talked about. It was like, oh, we're there, we're done. And we are curing some cancers. So it's not like it's going to suddenly just be there. It's just this evolution. And it just, I guess the older we get, we learn things take a lot of time. So it's not going to happen overnight.
Actually, there's this thing called Malone's Law, which is technology revolutions take longer than we predict, but arrive quicker than we're prepared for them. and I'm struck that 2-3 years ago, big data was everywhere. It was in articles, it was being claimed by different companies, and then it just sort of went underground, as if the media hype was done, and people they started to forget. Meanwhile, there's this fervor going on. When does it resurface? When does it come back with a vengeance?
I think the name's going to go away, but we're going to get used to it. Big data is going to be part of the air. It's going to be part of the words, part of the language that we use, and we won't think of it as big data. We're just going to be used to it because
it's like the internet,
we're always
right?
with it.
Yeah, the internet.
So
we talked about
name.
the internet, and now we don't even talk about it but we just use it.
I have a question for the audience. So if you all know about 23andMe, you can spin a tube, mail it off, and it'll tell you, tell me if I'm saying this correctly, but it'll tell you what diseases or illnesses you may or may not are likely to develop during your life. So how many of you here in the audience want to know now in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, what you may develop later in life? And just raise your hands if you want to know. Okay, so it's about half the audience, which is almost, every time I've asked this question, it's always, and it's not by gender or race or anything.
It's always half.
Yeah, it's always about 50%. It's really interesting because some people say, why on earth would I want to know when I'm in my 40s that I have an 80% chance of developing Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or whatever? And other people say, hell yeah, I want to know because I want to start looking at, are there treatments, is there diet, is there nutrition, are there clinical studies? It's very interesting, just the different attitudes. I'm just curious, again, this idea of data as a mirror, of seeing something that's in us, but we had no way of extracting or measuring that data. Some people just don't want to know.
Right. And they don't have to. That's the great thing. It's completely optional. And so I think for the people who do want to do it, those are the people, and as has been publicized about 23andMe, 80% of people contribute to the research effort, which is amazing. And so for those people who are interested in knowing, one of the first things you want to do the minute you find out about yourself through your genetics or whatever portal, you want to find other people who are like you. And that's where the social piece of it becomes so interesting. How can we learn from each other, compare notes? There's a community in 23andMe called the ApoE Cafe. And it's ApoE Cafe. It's the gene, if you've got a certain mutation in that gene, your risk for Alzheimer's is pretty dramatically increased. And so these people have all come together, they read the literature, they read the papers, and then they compare what they think it means, and maybe they should have a higher fat diet, or maybe they should drink more water with silica in it because it takes aluminum out of your body. There's all kinds of theories, and there are people who are starting to take action on that. So I think as long as they're not harming themselves, it's a really positive thing. But so for those people who would rather not know, then that's fine too. But I think we're going to learn from these people who are going to be the pioneers in this new data era.
What if it turns out that the data that we're using is actually incomplete? The fact is that you're not just your DNA, it's everything that's in your gut and the microbiome and everything else. So whatever we might be doing correlating the information about the human DNA may be giving us false indications because we don't know about all the other stuff that has to be around So you're levitating out of your chair.
One of the things we kept hearing and talking to all the experts during the movie was how we're learning how much we don't know, how little we know, and that with all this new knowledge, we're realizing that we're just at the beginning, and that all this data is really giving us the ability to understand the world in ways that we never thought possible.
And this is
before.
the caveman era of big data.
Yeah, very much.
This gets to the question you posed to us a few minutes ago, right? What is big data, really? And the things you see as common themes from a technology standpoint: diversity of information, whether it's biological, whether it's coming from sensors and machinery, whether it's coming from social media and society, the ability to understand it differently, and that's going to show up in very different ways. And one of the points that was made, I thought really eloquently filmed, was this notion that the information is one thing, acting on it is something else. Yeah. And I think that question is going to end up being very woven into how we think about this whole topic of big data going forward.
Yeah, I want to get to that in a minute because I think the Internet of Things may be a transition point between people and their computers. Let me ask you about one more phenomenon about technology revolutions, and that is everybody's in such a flurry when it starts out that no one's really keeping track of who did what. And then about 10 or 20 years down the line, usually about the time the Nobel Committee starts looking at these things, then you have to determine who were the founders. As a historian, I'm usually one of the guys that ends up writing that book, and I found myself in a tremendous debate over the invention of the microprocessor. Is it Ted Hoff? Is it Federico Fagin? Is it, Shima? When I think of the internet, I think of you, Vint, I think of Tim Berners-Lee, I think maybe Paul Barron for packet switching. Okay, who is the father or mother of big data? Let's start the conversation now. We might as well begin the debate. Wow. Any suggestions?
I think we all are, because we all generate the data. I think it's all of us. I think it's everybody in this room. I mean, the fact is that everything now, all our devices, we are all contributing to this data loop, and that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, but someone's going to claim it, so
That's true.
yeah, we're all contributing.
It's really a difficult one because
it won't be a woman, I have a feeling.
So much.
Just had to say that.
So much of it is incremental progress.
Right, yeah.
Right? I mean, you can trace it all the way back to Codd's paper, right, 1971, about the relational data model. So much of what we do today with data is actually rooted back in that invention, basically. So machinery, the internet, all this stuff is that we live in an era where there's a crucible between the ubiquity of connectivity, the cloud computing capability over information, the analytics techniques. All this has now come together into this moment that's going to breed all this new life. What's the root of it?
I think might be an answer to this. If you look at the census, which was a pretty important data collection process, the first one that used the Hollerith cards was 1890. Am I remembering that correctly?
So Herman Hollerith
Herman Hollerith is the inventor of big data. And if you, he was the enabler of big data. It made it possible to process this stuff in a way that we couldn't before. The other group, which probably has a good possible candidacy, would be the physicists, because a lot of their experiments generate enormous amounts of data, the Large Hadron Collider being an example of that. The astronomers are starting to be collectors of enormous amounts of data, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, for example, when it goes into operation. So I think what's happened is that technology has enabled us to do things that we would never have done before because it was either economically impossible or it would have taken too long. And the technology now makes it feasible to do that. And so more and more people are thinking of ways of collecting and processing data than ever before.
John Battelle was saying we're only in the first minute of the first inning. But one of the things I find amazing is, as we've seen, big data has more range than almost any new technology I've ever seen this early in the process. I mean, I wrote down a number of places where it's already having a major impact. Health and medicine, including everything from personal health monitoring to genetics, transportation, everything from autonomous vehicles, mass transit, the natural sciences, cosmology, retail, including consumer customization and purchasing predictions, anthropology, epidemiology, conservation, economics, weather forecasting and management, defense, and I could have probably listed 20 more, and the audience could probably come up with 100 more besides that. I've never seen a new technology hit so many places simultaneously. Which ones of those intrigue you the most? Which ones do you think are seeing the greatest advances? What should we be watching?
Medicine, certainly. I mean, that list that you gave us was the list that we wrestled with the film, because, like, where do you start? There were so many subjects that we could have covered, and we kept coming back to the ones that were the most human, the most personal. But medicine really kept popping out wherever we went, and that notion that, modern medicine as we know it is really still very young, and suddenly we have all this information that we're getting that's advancing that knowledge. So I think that's the one place where you're going to see huge leaps.
Yeah, disease diagnoses, some of them were defined in the 1700s, and we haven't really changed much about that. And so think about people who are now suddenly tracking all of their symptoms, and they can compare their symptoms to other people who have the same disease label, and they find out, wow, I really actually match up more with the people with rheumatoid arthritis than MS. What's going on here? And so I think the assembling of all of that personal data that people have tracked about themselves could redefine disease. And that's really this notion of personalized medicine or precision medicine now, which is an initiative coming out of the government. That has to come from personal data. That's the only way we're going to get to knowing what drug you should take versus the one I should take, what disease you have. And it's not going to just be Parkinson's, it'll be Parkinson's type 2A. That's where big data is going to lead us. And we're getting there in cancer now, which is very exciting. But I think it's going to happen across the board.
I challenge your question a little bit, because computing had this profound impact on everything you listed and on the other 40 things that the audience would list, right? And I actually think big data is just the state of computing today. And there's going to be no separation between that in the future. When we look back, 10 years from now, we look over the last 5 years, 20 years ago, or 20 years from now, we look back over the last 10 years, we're not going to be able to separate computing from big data. We're just not going to. Data is woven through everything, and I love this analogy of your son with the eyes and 1,000 eyes, because what it really in part is about opening up all these new ways of seeing the things that the computers want us to, that are already there, right? And so when we look back at this from the future, we're not going to be able to distinguish it. It just is how computing has helped us evolve.
It'll be what knowledge is.
Yeah, but I'm intrigued. Yeah. Computers for the first 10 years were doing artillery trajectories, right?
When they weren't cracking code.
When they weren't cracking codes.
That's because
but this, I mean, it strikes me, this isn't just big computing. This is also big analog. This big sensing that we have to penetrate out into the physical world, which, the first 30 years of computing never did. It was MIS guys in a glass box, putting in print, cards. This is a different game, and I'm struck by the scale of this as well. And we look at Facebook and we say this is the fastest scaling company of all time, 0 to $1 billion in 10 years. But we look at big data. There's 600 million people in China that are now being studied who have chronic illnesses. I mean, we're looking at incredible scaling of this at a very fast speed with no real precedent.
Francis Collins, who's the head of the National Institute for Health, spoke at Jay's TED Med conference a couple of years ago, and he said something really interesting. He said, huge pharmaceutical companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing new drugs to cure some of the biggest illnesses facing our species, and then when they get into human clinical trials, they unfortunately find out that some of these new drugs will have an adverse effect. Even though it'll help most people, a small subset will be effectively killed or maimed or harmed in some way, so the FDA will never approve that drug. But when Steve Jobs was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I think it cost $100,000 to sequence his genome. And now today, I think it's down to $300. And Francis Collins said he believes, as I think someone said in the film, that it's going to be a $10 test at your local, Duane Reade, and that no doctor will be able to prescribe even an Advil without first looking at your genome. But he said what's incredible is that all these drugs exist, and they're sitting on the shelves gathering dust, and that with a $10 test, it'll say that Linda will be cured and Rick will be harmed. And I mean, that's amazing to think that all this stuff, the work's been done. But right. this little inexpensive test, because of big data, is about to unleash this whole series of drugs that can help us.
Does big data signal the end of statistics? Do we no longer sample? Do we just measure everything now? I mean, we've lived in a world for 300 or 400 years driven by statistics because we can't measure everything. We take samples and then we blow it up and hope that it works. Do we do that anymore? Or from here on out, we measure everything?
No, I think that you'll still find people taking advantage of the fact that statistics works. We can certainly attest to that. Bayes' law really helps a lot. So especially when you only have partial information. I don't think that we're going to lose the statistical sampling idea, but I did want to warn you about something. Everything that you're talking about right now, seeing all this data everywhere, is kind of a snapshot of the current state of affairs, huge amounts of content stored all over the place. But I'd like to tell you that there is a kind of digital dark age that can arrive because the data will no longer be interpretable. Because when you collect data, you have to collect the metadata that helps you interpret it correctly. A bunch of numbers means nothing unless you know whether it was degrees Fahrenheit or centigrade or pressure or some other metric. So if you don't record what the data is, where it came from, what the conditions were under its collection, what the calibration was of the instrument and everything else, that data may no longer be meaningful. And it gets worse over time because if there was special software that was needed to correctly evaluate and analyze the data and the software doesn't work on today's or the future operating systems, we may actually find ourselves accumulating large amounts of data which is meaningless. And so while we're getting all excited about the accumulation of data, we should remember that we may be losing it at the same time. The other point I wanted to make was about time series, because the one thing that is the most revealing about data is collecting data over time and then understanding something about what has changed over time. And that's probably the place where the biggest insights are likely to arrive, is if we can hold on to data for a long period of time and analyze its changes. That will give us insight that we couldn't otherwise get. But then we have to know what the data means, and we have to remember that for a long time.
Now we're on the brink of the Internet of Things. Another thing we don't really have a definition for that's exploded now is disappearing.
I hate the phrase.
Pardon me?
I hate the phrase.
Yes. But there's something happening, and our devices are going to start talking to each other, and people are saying it could be 1,000 times larger than the Internet. What does that do to big data? It seems to me it makes it even more of a necessity, but it also poses the potential of just completely overwhelming everything.
A lot of those devices are going to generate small amounts of data. I mean, I have a sensory network in the house. Every 5 minutes it collects the temperature, humidity, and light levels in every room in the house and sends it to a server in the basement. I know, only a geek would do that. But at the end of the year, I have all this good data about how well the heating and ventilation and air conditioning work, and I can adjust things. But the total amount of data is very small. So for a lot of these cases, even though there may be billions of devices, the total amount of data may not be anything like what we generate with video, for example, that we just saw. So I'm not too worried yet about the scaling effect of the Internet of Things. You mentioned that we're on the cusp. I always think of the story about the Soviet Tsar who says, "Comrades, we stand on the edge of the great abyss. Tomorrow we take the great leap forward." So maybe that's where we are right now.
Actually, I have another
Stock
question.
up on food on the way out.
I have a question for the audience. If all of you went home tonight and you opened your mail and there was a letter from your MasterCard or Visa or Amex and it said, "Dear customer, we decided we're not going to itemize your bill anymore. We're just going to send you a total. Would you please write us a check for $2,473? Anybody in here pay that bill? Of course not, right? So how come every month we get an electrical bill? We have absolutely no idea what it is we're paying for, except that it gets higher every month. So there's a guy in the film, Sweetak Patel, who's the MacArthur Fellow. He started 3 companies. I think he's 29 years old. So he's created a little device. You plug one place in your house, and it recognizes the digital signature of every appliance in your house. It can tell you what your toaster oven, your hairdryer, your dishwasher. And so we said to him, "This is great, so now I have this nuanced look, but I still have to pay my bill." We said, one of the things about this data world is you get feedback that changes your behavior. I said, "Did you see something in the data that made you do something differently?" So he thinks about this for a minute. He goes, "Well, yeah, actually, there was one thing that really surprised us. We found that the average American spends 10% of their monthly electrical bill on their DVR. The little box under the TV that nobody thinks about with a hard drive, because when it was designed, nobody thought of designing it to spin down when you're not recording, Desperate Housewives on Thursday night. The rest of the week, it's spinning." So he said, instead of another nuclear power plant or digging another oil well, just redesign the damn DVR or turn the damn thing off.
Maybe they just turned it off permanently. That might
Good
be
idea.
Too.
PBS wouldn't like that, though. So.
In part, what you're talking about is this continuum of computing, right? Things that are at the very edge versus things that are up in the cloud, and we're going to always be collecting as much information as we can possibly squeeze through the pipes to do that processing. You know, we talk about some machine learning techniques that go on in big search and stuff. The thing that the data scientists are always hungry for is not fine-tuning our algorithms. They want more data. It's always more data, more data, more data is the mantra, right? They'd rather have more data than 3 more smart PhDs that can tune algorithms, right? And so that spectrum across what's on the edge and how much we bring up is always going to be something that is fundamental to the architecture of everything that we do.
But one of the pluses about
Go ahead. Go ahead.
the pluses of even at little data, one of the things we were talking about earlier was a group of families that I'm working with that all have kids with autism. And they put an environmental sensor in one of their in-home classrooms. And they started tracking when the daughter had seizures. And once they put in this room monitor, literally after having it in, I think, for a week, they started to notice that every time she had a seizure, the CO2 level alarm was going off in the room. That's the kind of revealing thing that we could start to see that we would have never picked up without this idea of Internet of Things and censoring our environments. And so even with that little bit of data, that can be really insightful. But then it's where do we take that information? How do we continue to study that? But it helps us kind of focus in on an area that might be really important. So I think that's really what we have to be able to do is winnow down on what's answering some questions that we have rather than just taking big data in all the time, which I think people will get pretty sick of pretty fast.
Sandy, do you have something to say?
Oh, just sort of a tangent, which is that the data itself is neutral. It's what we do with it.
Yes.
And that's the big thing. Is the data is just out there, but how do we use it? What do we do with it? What do we see in it? And that's really what becomes more important in the end of it. You know.
I think that, this is a tiny example, but there's a gentleman named Hugo Campos who was going to be here tonight, but unfortunately he couldn't come. But he had a pacemaker installed.
Oh, that's not the reason that he couldn't come.
No, it's not. But he also tracks his sleep, his diet, his alcohol consumption. So he called the company that made the pacemaker, and he said, I'd like to get 6 months of the data that I've been generating because I want to correlate it and see if there's some activity that's triggering my pacemaker. And
I think he learned he can't drink scotch. That's
what. Well, there was this long pause on the phone, and the woman on the other side of the phone who represented the manufacturer said, well, that's our proprietary data. He said, what are you talking about? My heart created the data. I want a copy of the data that I created. And there's this whole thing. I mean, I think one of the things that Sandy and I felt in doing this project was, who owns our data? And shouldn't we have some say about whether, instead of opting out, we should only opt in. Like the default should be set to off. Because I think that most people are not aware, as you heard in the film, of how useful this data is to corporations and to governments. I mean, think about this. 10 years ago, if someone had said to you, do you mind if I plant a little tracking device on you that would tell me what you're reading, what you're buying, who you're talking to, how much time you're spending doing this and that? You'd say, no way in hell would I let somebody track me. And now we're lining up and sleeping in front of the Apple store for 3 days for the privilege. Right?
We pay money to have that done.
So, I mean, but there's a trade-off.
You make this point, right, about the cell phone records. And if you call up the cell phone company and ask them for records of your own whereabouts, they're not going to give it to you.
No.
So, I mean,
but that is going to change policy. There will be a war over this.
Which is a conversation that we wanted to start in this movie, which is asking the questions about this data we're all putting out. Who owns it? Do we have a right to it? And are we just going to basically give it away for free when other people are making huge profits from it?
We need to talk about this now before all this stuff is set in stone.
So do we need a Bill of Rights?
Well, I think a data bill of rights.
Absolutely.
There may be something even, maybe there isn't anything more fundamental than that, but let me mention to you that there's intellectual property rules that currently apply. For example, if someone takes a photograph of you, guess who owns that photograph? It's not you, it's the photographer. If somebody records this session tonight, guess who owns the recording? The recordist, not you. And so right now our intellectual property rules are kind of the inverse of what I am hearing you say you would like, which is to own your own data. So you were about to say a data bill of rights.
I mean, I was struck that the founders of this country, you go back and read during the Revolutionary period, they talked about freedom and liberty, and they were two distinct things. We tend to conflate them. But freedom is the ability to participate in everything in society. That's why we have the Emancipation Proclamation. But liberty is the ability to control your own life and live it the way you want to. And I'm struck when we're spewing out all this data and our actions are being predicted and everything else. Do we surrender our liberty?
Wait. you left out something important here about this thing. We are not free to do any damn thing we want to. One of the reasons that we accept this society and the rule of laws is because we're willing to accept some limits on what we are free to do in exchange for safety and pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness.
But have we surrendered our privacy?
Well, no, it's a good question. I'm only saying that what we've already agreed is that we will accept some limitations, whatever they turn out to be, as we transform things, in order to preserve a safe and civil society. So I'm not disagreeing with anything, I'm just saying that we aren't looking for absolute, total freedom to do whatever we want to without any consequences.
Now, I'm struck it seems to be a generational thing, that those of us with gray hair seem to be very concerned about privacy and liberty, and I talk to my 25-year-old and 20-year-old, they don't care. They're not, it doesn't even enter their conversation.
Mike, can we open that up to the audience? I'd love to get some feedback from the audience, and this is a really great question to open up because the question of privacy is one that really comes up in most of these screenings. So we've got two mics up here.
What was it that Scott McNeely said about 15 years ago? There isn't any privacy, get over it.
Yeah.
But that is a very generational thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi guys, I'm Patrice Barube. I'm Canadian, living in the Bay Area now, solution architect. And one interesting thing that brings tonight, the last subject, is privacy of data. So before, I was involved as a demographic analyst. So you have to use data from populations and figure out what it will be in 20 years from now, which school they need, which roads they need, which service they need. And at that time, it was an art. Now, with big data, it becomes a science because you have all that data that people contribute telling you how many kids they want, where they want to live. And I see big data as a very good opportunity to serve the population a lot better than we used to do before. And I want your idea on that. What do you think all that big data can help us serve people better?
Well, going back to the medicine point, where we can predict now in advance what diseases people might get and what, if they do get sick, then what treatments will be the most appropriate for them. But I think the prevention model is even more important, that if we can prevent so many of these common diseases now that we're seeing, the type 2 diabetes is a great example. So I think that predictive modeling is going to be really important in the health space, certainly.
Can I give one example of predictive stuff that I was fascinated by? When the earthquake hit in Japan, I think it was 8 years ago, I heard an amazing story on Marketplace, Kai Risdale's program on National Public Radio, and he said that 15 seconds before the earthquake hit, every bullet train in every factory in Japan was brought to a halt. That they actually had spent $500 million over 15 years since the Kobe earthquake installing dedicated hardwired sensors. And it was set up if a certain magnitude of earthquake there's some wave that comes before the violent wave, like 12 seconds before. And I thought, this is so amazing that it actually worked. And then the next day I heard a story that a group of programmers in Palo Alto realized that all of our laptops have accelerometers in them. So if your kids are running through the kitchen and they trip over the cord and your laptop's plummeting, your laptop knows it's falling and it turns itself off. It actually lifts the head off the platter. So these guys wrote a program called Quake Catcher. And so now, before people go to bed, all over the world, there's hundreds of thousands of people that fire up Quake Catcher. And so on the one side, you've got a $500 million hardwired system that has to be censored and monitored and repaired. On the other side, you've got a ubiquitous, crowdsourced, completely free system where people just helping each other. And I think it's so inspiring that as a species, we're looking out after each other. And so many of the stories that Sandy had in the movie of the woman, where you find out that she's trying to learn about preemie babies, and you find out that the sort of inciting event was the loss of her own child, or the fellow whose wife was in Haiti and he didn't know if she was alive. So many of these are one individual. I mean, so many of us feel like we can't make a difference in the world. And so many of those stories were so inspiring about one person solving a problem for themselves that ripples out throughout the rest of our species.
So what you've just said makes me think of the old phrase that information is power. I don't think that's right. I think it's information sharing is power. And when we share information, we make ourselves, all of us, ourselves more powerful.
There's our quote for the night.
Sorry, we've got questions.
Hi, how's it going? My name is Ryan. I'm 26, and I demand access to my data. First off, I would like to know how much vinegar makes me drink to make my hair curly. That would be nice to know. But what really I want to understand is companies like Pacific Bio, who are taking our genome and our cells in real time, and their stock is blown up from $4 to $12 in the last 2 months. Or companies like Amberella, who's recording the physics of our life, like we saw of people moving around and their environment, how close they are to the table, how far their mom's from them, or what objects are around them, what shape them, and who they come to be. I guess my question is with all this technology and how technology shapes our culture, and Facebook with all the data, and maybe Twitter or Instagram or just Fitbit or Amberella with our environment, or people taking satellite imagery of what parking spot is available at what time and what access we have to it. Do you see culture sort of changing towards maybe more of a cosmopolitan? I'm not trying to say like a one world type of place, but more of an understanding where there's less profiling because we can understand better on a more minute level, where we can kind of access one's information, where we can communicate better. In this key point of real time, where we've never had before, or maybe like broadcast journalists or ENG microwave, Cron, KTVU, Fox, or there's a lot of ENG crews who have come out and recorded data in real time. Are we passing the point where the people have become the photojournalists, the people are the news crew, and we've surpassed this point where the medium of being controlled is set by our tone and not yours?
Wow.
Yeah. That's a lot of questions. I mean, it's very clear. It already has changed our society, right? And the internet as just a beginning artifact of big data has opened up communication globally. We talk about some of the stuff even in your video around societal changes that have happened that have been enabled in part by that.
In a really simple way, I just got a Facebook request last week from a girl that I met in Nepal 3 years ago who lived in a village with no running water, no electricity. And she gave me a Facebook request, and she looked like she could be in Beverly Hills, and she was now connected to the world, and she has access to the same education that anybody else does. And to me, that's a game changer. The fact that now the world is online, people have access to information in a way that they never did. That is going to have a huge, profound effect on us as a global society.
Yeah, and I have 3 millennial children, and I have to say, they think about the world so differently than our generation. They see it flat, and they see people looking the same, and it's really exciting to see where they're going to take the world. And I can only imagine the generation that's coming up behind them that's been born completely into this world of data and information, and how differently they may even think. And I hope it continues of this trend we're seeing with the millennial generation.
There's something that Jennifer Polka said in the film that I think relates to your question, which is the idea of the body putting blood where it's needed. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things we're seeing is this data is allowing us to use the limited resources we have and put it in the right place. Like Marissa Meyer told me this wonderful story when we were first brainstorming, because she had a lot of great ideas, and she said they're using satellite imagery, I forget which country it is, where they can actually look at a particular, like a spectrum of color on bodies of water to determine if there are mosquito larvae there. And so they're actually able to go and only put DDT and eradication of mosquitoes in the places where it needs to go, instead of just spraying everywhere, including the environment and using the cost. So being able to target where the resources need to go is one of the things we're allowed to do.
So I wanted to come back to the privacy question for just a second, because I think people probably care a lot about information that might be about them, but they also care who has access to it and under what circumstances. And there are situations where you actually want people to have access to it. Imagine, for example, that we all see our medical information as being private. We want to have some notion of who has access to it. But imagine that you're in a city you've never been in before, you have a medical crisis, and you're in the emergency room. At that point, you want the doctors to have access to every piece of information they could possibly need in order to make sure that you get past this crisis alive. After you get through it, assuming you survive, you don't want them to have access to the information forever as a consequence of that one incident. And so the idea of being able to grant ephemeral access to things and to take it away seems very important. And I'll give you one other example. Some things that you might accumulate sound kind of innocuous, like the temperature in every room in the house, in my case, every 5 minutes stored away. If someone had access to that information accumulated over 6 months, they might be able to figure out how many people live in the house, when do they come and go, what are their diurnal patterns, is anybody home? And a criminal might find that very useful. On the other hand, if the house is on fire, it might be that the fire department could help figure out, who is where and, how do I rescue them? You would want them to have access, again, only during that, under those certain conditions. I don't think that we've really delved very well into the space of ephemeral control over access to information and determining who is legitimate and who is not.
Now, obviously, politics is going to get involved in this. It has to.
Yeah.
And I was struck watching, we're looking at Chicago. And
Chicago. Okay.
Chicago,
Well, already we know we have a
which is
problem.
collapsing, which appears to be collapsing into a primordial state. Murders everywhere, and we hear about how they're going to add extra buses at the bus stop. And if I was somebody living in Chicago, I might want that big data dedicated more to stopping, finding people that are going to try to kill me. And so there's going to be a prioritization. The one about Brooklyn. Okay, yeah, Flatbush and Myrtle Avenue. Bed-Stuy, bad place to be, okay? We know what block is the worst block. I mean, one answer is, yes, let's work with these people, and the other one, but the more practical, immediate solution, give them all money to move away and bulldoze the block down. And there's going to be a body of people that will choose that option. So who does the prioritizing on this, on what matters and how we react to this information?
Let me give you an example in London. This is a real example. I was visiting in the Prime Minister's office, not the Prime Minister, but some of his deputies, and they were showing me a big map of London, and it showed where all the crimes were and what the level of intensity was. And there was a huge hoo-ha about whether they should publish this, because they thought if they published it, everybody would move away from the high crime regions. That's not what happened. They published the information, and the police department decided to concentrate on the areas of high crime, and the numbers got better as a result. This gentleman's been waiting to ask a question.
Oh, yeah, this poor guy.
Yeah.
Fire away, man. I'm sorry.
My name is Hunter Whitney. I am a user experience designer, and I work with data-intensive applications in life science and cybersecurity. So I feel like big data has not gone anywhere in my book. It's in my daily life. So I'm looking at the title, and I'm thinking, the human face of big data. What I think is the interface to data is what makes humans able to use it. That's what I do. And what I find in my work in these areas is that the technology is far outstripping people's interests or ability or focus or resources towards making the interpretation of that data, the communication of that data, and the filtering of that data useful. And with a quick note, I got my whole genome sequenced recently. Kind of an extensive step, as you can imagine. But even there, when I looked at it, it was not complete. Things like ApoE maybe were not there for reasons which have nothing to do with clinical measures, but policy. So it's interpretation, even for someone who has some sophistication. So I'd be interested in your comments about the interface of data for human beings.
I think it's an important question. We talk about the end result of this being helping people take some action, right? And humans we're visual animals, and we need to be able to see things before we can really understand them and interpret them. And I think that the question of how it is that information is understood is going to become one ultimately of how it is that we can see it. And this whole the sort of next generation, if you will, of what's coming in big data is around machine learning, deep learning, AI, NLP, etc. And that whole modality is going to help us be able to focus on some of the right questions where there is to look at. Yeah.
So half of what I do is thinking about the interface between ML, AI, and human intelligence. It's a moving target, but it's that interface between data and algorithm or intelligence and human intellect.
That's right. And I think our best hope right now is that the machinery can help us look and see what's important for us to then really interpret what it means and what to do about it.
And ask the questions.
Yeah.
I think we've learned a lot just watching Facebook, and I think it goes back to not so much privacy, but it's more control, that we have the control when we share our data, when we pull it back, and we've seen Facebook go through these iterations of a user interface, of me understanding who actually sees my pictures, and is it public, is it private, is it this little group of friends? That whole interface is a huge design challenge, and so I think it's incumbent on all of us who build companies that help people store their data, that we have to make those crystal clear. And it's a huge design problem, but I think we can do it. But it's great to have people like you thinking about it.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's really hard.
It's
I mean, just go to some of those policy pages and you're kind of scratching your head. And to your point, where you said, hey, look, the temperature gradation, data, when there's a fire, I really want them to have this information. But like, who thinks about that when they move into the house, right? And so how do we make that really attainable and easy for people to fall into the right behavior?
This is part of the big challenge. And the Internet of Things poses this challenge in many ways, because these little devices may be just chattering away, generating all kinds of data, or you don't want them to accept control, like from the 15-year-old next door in particular, especially if it takes over your entertainment system. I worry about them taking over the climate control in my wine cellar. I mean, that's really important. So the idea that these little gadgets have to be paranoid and say, I won't listen to somebody I'm not supposed to listen to. I won't share data with anybody I'm not supposed to share it with. The technologists in the group here have to figure out actually how to do that in a safe way. And if it involves crypto, you can be sure somebody's going to forget the damn variable or the password or whatever it is, and then you have to figure out how to recover from that. Otherwise, your house doesn't work anymore. Sorry,
Piece of information. I asked some people out there in the big data world what they think are the things that are limiting the advance of big data, and I got three answers. One of them is the development of sensor technology. 20 years ago, if you said you were an analog engineer, it was like admitting you had leprosy, because no one cared about analog anymore. Now it's ascendant, but we lost a lot of time. How long do you think before sensor technology reaches the point that we want it to be, to really do big data?
Oh, we already do. I mean, I think this business about continuous monitoring of your own vital signs, there couldn't be anything more important than that, for the simple reason that the continuous monitoring tells us what's normal, and if there's a deviation from that, it tells us maybe you should go check that out. And that sort of continuous monitoring is invaluable across not only live systems, biological systems, but also big complex systems like cities.
But you would admit
Bridges that can tell you they're becoming unstable before they actually collapse.
They're talking about making 1 billion tiny chips and flinging them into the atmosphere and letting the air currents carry them around so we can steady weather to a level we've never done before.
I worry about breathing those things.
Very, very small.
Mike, I'm told we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, but
Oh,
let
and
me
we got
list 2 more
already.
real quick so you guys know. Analytics. Analytics seems to be chasing the data. There's more data than we're able to process right now, and that may take a generation to catch up. And the third one is adoption, which is IT departments and corporations don't like big data because they have to hand it off to data scientists and they don't have the control they used to have, so they resist it. Your doctor doesn't want you sending all of your medical data right now 24/7 because he can't process it. So there's going to be a long adoption curve that's going to take much longer than the technology is to reach some sort of peak. So those are the 3 limiting factors.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this amazing opportunity to watch this movie. I don't know how much work went through it, but just watching it just blows my mind off. You went through all over the world to get all the data, so thank you. My name is Reshma, and I'm actually a technology writer. I'm a mom of 6 kids, ages 9 to 24. And I've been in the Bay Area for 25 years. And my question is, the human face of big data. Humans are in all age group, and as we saw in the movie, there is a father who filmed his baby from the birth time and just monitored it for 2 years. I'm an advocate for children's privacy and security online. Coincidentally, today is the Safe Internet Day. I don't know how many of you were familiar with that. So my concern is, we are moving into a 2014 or 2015 education phase, especially in America across 48 states. Everything is moving into, in the education sector, on technology, you're collecting data on kids in school from age kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. Who has access to that data in public schools? And why aren't we more concerned as parents to control all the data of our family and own it? And why are we giving away our data and privacy? And why aren't any laws formed? And why aren't we looking into that, where we save our own data and own it and kind of have the liberty, if you want to give it to someone to analyze it, or if you don't want to give it to someone to analyze it, but we should be owning it ourselves.
Comments?
Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments on that?
Well, there is this growing movement about a Bill of Rights, and I think more people have to stand up and say, we want this. And there have been laws that have been...
Parents have no idea how much data is being
Well, and the other question is what harm has come from that? That until you see a really major problem that emerges from access to data, that people aren't probably as concerned about it, but the minute something happens, then that's when you'll see a pullback. But it's just going to be this evolution of continual data coming in and what's done with that. And if it continues to do more positive things than bad things, then I don't think that many people will push back on it.
I also think, Sandy, the single scariest line in your whole documentary was the guy that said, even if the phone company doesn't know who you are, they have all the data, they know who you are. And I think a lot of people still think, oh, all that information's anonymized. You know, it has nothing to do with me, it's just being gathered in mountains. But no.
That was Joichi Ito, who runs the Media Lab at MIT, a guy worth listening to.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
All that information.
One more question.
Last question?
Wait, we have 3 people lined up.
I think we're being told we're running out of time.
Okay, so we're lightning round. Can you do a question in 2 sentences?
Yes. Carl Hewitt. The European Court of Justice has just ruled that mass surveillance of Europeans is illegal. How is Silicon Valley going to survive, given that we make most of our money abroad and they don't trust us anymore?
I'll let Vint answer that.
Yeah, there you go.
At the moment, we're being saddled with a whole bunch of European, what's the right word for this, where your laws are extraterritorial constraints on businesses here in the United States, and I do worry a lot about where that's headed.
Yes.
Thank you. Our firm works with clients like yours to help create new markets. We get massive amounts of data that cannot be useful because we don't yet have the art to understand the data that we're collecting, you've been talking about. How do we start to establish the art to understand the science?
The art?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the question asked earlier. I think there's a big piece of it, which is it can be about how domain, and it's hard work, right? It's domain by domain. We go in and understand what the meaning and the semantics of the information really are, and what the best ways for people to understand that and visualize it are. And actually, about 10 minutes into the movie, there are these amazing visuals of like the flights and all this stuff. And it's when you see stuff like that, you realize the power of it. But this is not going to come for free. This is going to come from, lots of people spending lots of time trying to understand how it is that we cognate that.
I'll come back to that notion that Jay talks about, is that it's opening up this invisible world. The information's there. We've just never been able to see it before.
Next question.
Hi, my name is...
Okay, last question.
My name is Piyush Madik, work for IBM in the field of data for 25 plus years. My question is, data can be used for good, but, the next world war could happen over data. Your comments?
Again, the data is neutral. It's what we as humans do with it, and that's our choices. That's the choice that we have to make, how to use it wisely.
Do you feel the security of nations is at threat because of data?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Security of nations is at threat because of misuse of data.
It could be, and it's something that I think we have to guard against, and it is definitely a new weapon. As we saw with the Sony hack, it can be used really badly. So yeah, it's one more thing that makes us more vulnerable.
One final question for you guys,
sure,
if I may,
Thank you.
Elaborating on yours. And that is, every great technology revolution starts out as something, but it doesn't end up that way. And it becomes something very different. If you remember Regis McKenna sat down and did all the potential applications for the microprocessor and convinced Intel to go into microprocessors. None of those applications ever came true. A whole bunch of other bigger things happened. I'm curious what the destiny of big data is. My gut says that when we start studying 1 billion people, we're going to see metadata emerge that we've never been able to see before, because it's beyond the ability of human beings to see, because maybe it takes hundreds of years or it takes billions of people. We're going to discover stuff about the natural world and about people that we've never known before, and I think it's going to change the way we see the world and ourselves. Do you guys agree with that? Do you disagree? Do you see another destiny for big data?
No, absolutely. It's the extension of our human need to know, and it's just a progression. We've always done that. We now have another tool to do that, but it's part of this natural course of, as humans, we want to know about the world and we want to learn more, and we are learning more.
I think the simple answer is that we have enabled our ability to process big data in the same, and we will wind up using this in ways that we didn't anticipate, just like the road system, the interstate highway system, was originally designed to carry missiles from one place to another to keep the Russians from targeting fixed silos. Guess what? We built the fixed silos. We didn't ever move the missiles around, but the roads turned into this gigantic, GDP enhancing thing because the housing boom and the automobile boom. In the case of big data, what will happen is that we will have the ability to do correlations on huge scale that we never could do before. And so I think that you are correct. We are going to see correlations and patterns that we never would have seen before, and it will lead to insights that we can't even begin to imagine.
Well, I think those insights will lead to behavior change. I think that maybe one of the more profound impacts could be, as a society, we start to understand the impacts, the small things we do, and the effect it has on the wider theater, so to say.
Last comment.
I wonder if we're on the verge of re-engineering our own species. When you go to Jamba Juice and it says, do you want the immunity boost? Imagine going to your doctor when your child is in the womb, and you say, I'd like to add intelligence, immunity, resilience, strength, creativity. That sounds like complete science fiction, but as we're starting to understand, we may be just on the verge of actually doing that, which is, maybe it's 30 years out. But
if this were, remember The Graduate and plastic? Now it's CRISPR-Cas9.
Yeah, right. Yes. Can I do you want to say one last thing about the future?
Well, I just hope we can solve the traffic problems in Palo Alto with big data.
So I have one thing I want to share before we finish, which is, Vint, can I turn you into Vanna White for a moment? This is a magic act. Right. So though you've seen a lot of money, we actually gave 10,000 copies of this book away on one day, thanks to our friends at FedEx, to world leaders and Fortune 500 CEOs and Olympic winners and athletes. So any of you have seen the Harry Potter movies, where in the newspaper you can actually talk to the person in the paper by touching them. So this is Brewster Kahle. This is if you can just hold the book up. This is Brewster Kahle, who came up with the idea of recording the internet in real time. Yeah. And so for historians, so I'm going to point, there's a free app. This is not the Human Face of Big Data iPad app. It actually comes with the book for free. So you point if I can do this, we'll see if this works. Half the time it does. So you point your phone or your tablet or whatever your device is, if you have a good internet connection. And then in a minute here, let's see if we can put Brewster here. Where's my microphone? Okay. Let's see. Hold on. Brewster.
We really need to put the best we have to offer within reach of our children. If we don't do that...
So throughout the book, there's 20 people that come alive when you point your iPhone or your Android phone or your tablet, and there's a little key in the book. This is designed by Michael Rylander, an incredible designer. And as you go through the book, you get to basically tap on these people and say, give me your TED Talk, tell me your story, I want to learn more. So if you love the movie and you want to learn more about big data, and you want the movie that Sandy did is spectacular. Each of these is a different way of examining and exploring this idea of big data. And the last thing I want to say is, someone said when you do these projects, do you start out with a clear idea of what you're going to do, or do you make it up as you go along? And the analogy that I always think of is, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, but you lost the box that the pieces came in. So you have no idea how the pieces fit together. So you keep, does this fit, does this fit? You tear it apart, you put it together 100 times until it all sort of makes sense. And that's what we did with the book. It's what Sandy did with the movie. I think The one last thing I want to say about the movie is that so many people who have seen this movie have said, I can't believe that was only 52 minutes, because there was so much in there. I watched it just now and I thought, this feels, I mean, not in a bad way that it's a long movie, but it's so dense and yet it doesn't feel rushed. And you come out, I think it's optimistic. I think there's a lot of things we need to be very cautious about. I mean, sort of like what Tim O'Reilly said at the end. I'm not blindly optimistic, but I think that this may be just the right tool for our species, just at the right time in our evolution to address some of these huge problems, because we need these tools right now. So thank you, everybody, for coming. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a big reception outside. Thank you again to SAP.
By the way, folks, as of today, I heard Richard Branson, working with Paramount Pictures, is going to start a Davos of big data.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
So thank you, panel. Thank you, everybody.